Thank you for joining the Fran Park Center for Faith and Life. Our mission is to serve the church and community through innovative, inclusive, and transformative education. Check out our website at www.franparkcenter.org for more information about upcoming events, programs, pilgrimages, and opportunities to get involved. If you enjoyed this program and would like to see more like it, please consider a donation. You can find more information of ways to support the Park Center on our website.
For those of you who aren't part of Pinnacle, I'm Wes Avram, the pastor at Pinnacle, and I have here on the screen with us is Taurian Lawson and Mike Hegeman, who are also pastors here at Pinnacle, and Heath Carter, who's our speaker tonight. This is part of a Fran Park Center for Faith and Life, a series of Zoom conversations during the season of Lent. We have 4 scheduled. This is the second of 4. Our topic is, can we share the future? Dialogues on the common good. For those of you who have been involved in Park Center programs over the years, you know that we like to situate our programming right between the church and the world, because that's where we all live as people of faith. And so we're continually stretching to understand the world in which we live, to seek to build bridges of dialogue across difference, to read the Bible in ways that are relevant to our lives, and to understand the tradition in broad and open ways that help us to illuminate our experience and learn to live faithful lives. So this is part of that, as we're trying to have conversations about the idea of the common good, to ask if rethinking that idea as part of a Christian commitment and Christian life might be a way for us to think about some of the challenges we're facing in the broader culture and in the church today. And we don't mean for this series to be the only way we do that. It's the beginning of a conversation. And the river is flowing, so we're going to go with the flow and see where that takes us over the coming months and years. Our series, as I mentioned, are 4 in number. The first is already, the recording of that series is already up on our YouTube channel, and a podcast, a shorter 20-minute podcast based on our first session, is available already on our Out of the Park podcast series at franparkcenter.org. That was a conversation with theologian, Professor Miroslav Volf, who spoke to us about the idea of home, the metaphor of home as a way of beginning to think about the common good. So we invite you to find that recording and that podcast based on that. And to become a part of that conversation if you weren't able to see that when it started. I'm going to talk to you about tonight's event in a moment. Our session after tonight's, our third session on March 24th, will be with a guest speaker, Taurian Webb. Taurian Webb is on the faculty and the administrative staff of Garrett Evangelical Theological Seminary, United Methodist Seminary in Evanston, Illinois, on the campus of my alma mater, but that doesn't matter. Taurian is the director of the Center for the Church and the Black Experience. He's very interested in questions of the intersection of art, expression, and theological conviction in a culture of pluralism and difference. And so he'll be with us on the 24th. And then our final session will have the 3 pastors of Pinnacle. Taurian, Mike, and myself will be summarizing what we heard over these sessions and starting a conversation amongst ourselves and inviting you all into that. And that is on the 31st at 6 p.m., 31st of March. Tonight's talk takes a practical turn, as we're in conversation with Professor Heath Carter. Heath is the associate professor at Princeton Theological Seminary, a seminary that we enjoy a partnership with and are deeply indebted to. He teaches and writes on the intersection of Christianity and American public life. He's the author of Union Made, Working People and the Rise of Social Christianity in Chicago, which was the runner-up for the American Society of Church History's 2015 Brewer Prize. And he's the co-editor of 3 books, The Pew and the Picket Line, Turning Points in the History of American Evangelicalism, and the 4th edition of a documentary history of religion in America. He's currently working on a new book called On Earth as It Is in Heaven, Social Christians and the Fight to End American Inequality. Heath has a family right there in Princeton, New Jersey. He's the father of 3 boys. So I've been 2/3 of the way there. So we understand the life you live. They're 13, 9, and 7. He's from Topeka, Kansas, which, so you all know, is the geographic center of the continental United States. So he comes to us from the center, even though he spent much of his life in Southern California. So you can interpret that any way you please. Heath, we're thrilled to have you with us tonight. Our conversation is going to be informal tonight. I'm going to ask a few questions. Heath's going to talk to us a little bit about his work. And then we'll have a time of question and answer and conversation after that. Does that sound about right, Heath?
Sounds great. Looking forward to it. Thanks so much for having me.
So we'll take about 45 minutes, y'all, and then we'll open up for some wider conversation. Heath, your particular area of expertise is, if I'm understanding right, late 19th century, early 20th century into mid 20th century social activism in the church, social gospel movement, social creeds, all that was churning in the life of the church in what was called the American century, the Christian Century magazine, which is still a regular magazine and read by many in the church, sort of came out of that height of optimism around the turn of the 20th century. These days, I think it can feel like Christians have lost their ability to speak clearly and confidently about the common good, a confidence that Christians, at least Christian leaders in some parts of the church, felt very deeply at the turn of the last century, and now feel quite confused about that. But I know, so that's not always been the case, that we've wondered where we fit, even if we've not really understood all the complexities of where we fit, the good and the bad of it. At least many of us thought we knew where we fit. But you're writing a book about what you call the Christian social tradition. How did that impact Christian self-awareness in the American context?
Yeah, I think so. I'm writing this book right now, and again, just wonderful to be with you all, and excited for this conversation. Hope to have some good back and forth later in our time together. I'm writing this book that's really about a tradition that it's easy to forget about. It's a tradition that, I would argue deeply shaped the nation, all the way up. You think about these kind of deeply significant, momentous social movements of the mid 20th century, right? The civil rights movement, the labor movement, people like Martin Luther King, Cesar Chavez, Fannie Lou Hamer, these sorts of deeply faith-filled activists. Today, I think about people like William Barber, for example, who's sort of picking up on some of those threads in today's, picked up the Poor People's Campaign in North Carolina and became kind of a national figure in recent years. Part of what I'm trying to do is to say, where did those traditions come from? It turns out they have a long history, and it's a history that we've forgotten because we live in the kind of wake of a different moment, kind of at the end of a different kind of time in our national history and in the history of the church. But 100 years ago, people were Christians around this country were talking about the church's role in pursuing social justice, pursuing kind of a more just and equal society. Sometimes they talked about it actually as just one of the most famous kind of theologians of this, what we call the social gospel movement, was a guy named Walter Rauschenbusch. Rauschenbusch talked about Christianizing the social order. And what he meant by that wasn't necessarily converting everyone to Christianity. I think he lived in a time, and this is a sort of a difference between his time and ours. When Rauschenbusch was writing in the first couple of decades of the 20th century, he could presume a Christian public, right? Most people in that time were Christian, at least culturally. That was their sensibility, even if they weren't church attending. So when he talked about Christianizing the social order, he didn't mean necessarily making converts. What he meant was creating a society in which sort of the principles that you might read about in the Sermon on the Mount would infuse every aspect of our life. from our economic life, our political life, our social life, that they would, in some deep and profound way, reflect what Jesus taught about loving our neighbor as ourselves and whatnot. And Rauschenbusch and many folks in the early 20th century really believed that could happen, that you could come at social questions, some of the most challenging social questions that we still wrestle with today, right? Questions about economic inequality, questions about war and peace, and we could come at those questions as Christians and find in the Gospels and in the Bible and in our tradition answers. And he thought, actually, Rauschenbusch in particular thought that Jesus had a lot to say about all sorts of sort of the issues, the challenges of modern life. And he thought that, along the way, the church had sort of lost sight of Jesus and Jesus's social ethic. So, I think in some sense, this idea that Christianity is not something that's purely private, it's not just about sort of my individual faith, it's not even just about our church community and what we might have together in church, but actually that Christianity has something powerful to contribute to the public square. That idea was it's been a really important idea throughout American history. And we could talk, it's complicated, as you said, Wes, and sort of, some of the confidence, right, went alongside what we now could say were serious blind spots, serious mistakes, errors, bad teaching, all of that's in the mix too. So I don't want to lift up kind of social gospel tradition as somehow a perfect reservoir for us today as we think about social problems. We can learn from both the strengths of these movements, this tradition, as I think about it, and also its weaknesses. So someone like Rauschenbusch, who has all sorts of things to say about economic justice, has nothing to say about racial injustice. In fact, toward the end of his life, he acknowledged this. And he says that, he had, and he's living at a time when certainly many people are thinking about racial injustice. People like Ida B. Wells had led and we're still leading kind of heroic charges against the NAACP, was mobilizing resistance to lynching, which remained a kind of scourge across the nation. And Rauschenbusch kind of late in his life says, I wasn't sure what to say about the problems of racism in the United States. So we can see obvious deep shortcomings, right, in this tradition, but we can also see someone like Martin Luther King Jr., who read Rauschenbusch in seminary and saw those shortcomings, but also took away from Rauschenbusch and from this kind of tradition a deep sense, again, of Christianity having something to say about social problems. So, lots of different kind of perspectives represented around this tradition, and you can find lots of different threads within it. But that kind of conviction that, something like economics, which sometimes today we think of as, well, that's just the market. The market has its own logics. The market has its own ways of operating. The market, isn't really under the judgment or the rule of the gospel in some significant way, because it's got its own. This tradition that I'm writing this book about would have said, no, the market is fully within actually the realm of the gospel. And Jesus had a lot to say about that. The Bible has a lot to say about that. So there's no realm of life, human life, common life, that you could imagine that is outside or beyond the question. One social gospel author loved to ask this question. It started as a social gospel question, not as an evangelical question. What would Jesus do? That was the question that Charles Sheldon asked in his social gospel novel in the 1890s. That question came out of this idea. And he had, kind of this imagined church. It was a novel, imagined church in the Midwest, where the pastor challenged his congregation to, in every decision they made, whether it was to hire or fire somebody, what kind of content to publish in your newspaper, all sorts of decisions. Don't make any of those decisions for a week, the pastor challenged them, without asking, what would Jesus do? It's not a great novel, by the way. So, I read it as a child. It's a little didactic. It's not a beautiful story, but it nevertheless illustrates the sense, the kind of profound, widespread sense that Christianity has a lot to say about these kind of fundamental questions of how do we live together in the world.
Several years ago, I met someone who was doing some work at the School for Social Work at the University of Chicago on the history of the social work movement.
Yeah.
And which she traced back to the settlement house movement in Chicago with explicitly religious roots.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And that the dominant kind of theory behind social work today denied its religious underpinnings.
Yeah.
And yet she traced it right back to this period of time you're describing and the Christian motivate, Jane Addams and the settlement house movement and the like. Do you agree with that story? And if so, what other things has that whole time deeded to our culture that the culture doesn't even know came out of it?
Yeah. I would say certainly, it's a complicated story. There's multiple threads, but the social work certainly has in its origins deep connections to all the sorts of things I've just been talking about. So I have a character in my book, a woman by the name of Mary McDowell. She was, she's, again, this is a forgotten person today, but she was someone, I find her story utterly riveting. She grew up in the Midwest, moved to Chicago as a young woman. She lived in Evanston, actually, where our next speaker will be coming from. She lived in Evanston, which was in the 1900s, 19th century. Evanston was sort of this Methodist hub, a kind of, pretty well-to-do suburb, but it was not just your average suburbs. Suburbs kind of emerged as a kind of escape from the city. Evanston was different in that Evanston was a hub of Christian activism. It was the headquarters of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, which, again, this is another one of these kind of forgotten organizations today, but that was profoundly important in its time in the late 19th and early 20th century. The WCTU was in part fighting for what its name indicated. It was fighting to prohibit alcohol, and it was deeply involved in the movement for prohibition. But one of its leaders, Frances Willard, was sort of a white Christian feminist of the late 19th century, and she became, in addition to fighting for temperance, she became one of the leading advocates of women's suffrage. She became one of the leading advocates of organized labor in the country. She had what she called a do everything policy. We have to do everything we can to make this country more Christian. So it was a kind of place where if you were a kind of good Christian person, you could feel pretty good about being in Evanston, right? You could feel like, oh, it's kind of nice here and we're sort of protected and whatnot, but we're also part of the right kinds of movements. Mary McDowell spent the first half of her life there. And basically what happened is she came across this woman, Jane Addams, who was she was one of the kind of lead nationally renowned settlement house workers. And she had founded this little outpost in a very poor neighborhood on the west side of Chicago called Hull House. You can still go see Hull House today in Chicago. They've got it pretty well preserved there near the University of Illinois Chicago campus. And McDowell starts hanging out around Hull House, and she starts meeting the men and the women who live in this poor neighborhood, immigrant people, workers, folks who were just trying to get by. Many of them didn't speak English. Many of them had very little kind of context for the kind of Protestant American culture that Mary McDowell had grown up around. Her mom gets sick, and so she moves back to Evanston around 1893. And while she's there, one of the most iconic labor disruptions of the late 19th century happens, this Pullman Strike. And all over the country, the churches are up in arms about this strike because basically, it's an amazing story. If you don't know the story of the Pullman Strike, basically, there's a little labor dispute in the model town of Pullman. It had been founded. This guy, George Pullman, was sort of a well-meaning captain of industry who thought, I've got the solution to the nation's industrial crisis. There have been all these sort of strikes and boycotts and labor disruptions. And Pullman comes along and he says, the key is you have to put workers into the right kind of environment. And if you give them a nice house and you give them a kind of a nice surrounding, all these other issues will go away. They'll kind of, they'll just adapt to industrial life in the ways that they should. And so Pullman built this gorgeous town. Again, you can go to Pullman, south side of Chicago today and see many of these beautiful brick row homes that he built for his workers. the gorgeous limestone Presbyterian church that still stands there in town. He owned everything. Huge depression in 1893. He owns the company. He owns the town. He cuts wages, doesn't cut rents. People go on strike. Very common in the late 19th century. What was uncommon was a guy named Eugene Debs had come around and founded this railway union, the American Railway Union. And he convinced, basically what happens is when the workers on Pullman go on strike, the American Railway Union convinces its members all over the country to refuse to work on any train that had a Pullman car attached to it. These were these luxury cars that kind of middle and upper class people like to travel in. It's kind of like first class today, right, on the airlines. So basically what happens is within a matter of weeks, the entire rail system comes grinding to a halt. And the middle and upper classes are just up in arms. They say, this is insane. It would be like, you know, the airway is being grounded today. So churches across the country are railing against the strike. They're railing against the workers who are going out on strike. They think this is the worst thing ever. And Mary McDowell is just, she knows these people. She doesn't know folks in Pullman, but she knows workers. She knows what their daily lives are like. She's met them. She's experienced kind of some of their struggles. And she thought that more might be going on in Pullman. And so she goes down to the neighborhood. She meets with this Methodist pastor who'd been one of the very few pastors in the country who kind of came alongside the strikers and supported them. And she started asking him questions about, you know, what about this strike, you know, what's going on? And he starts to tell her more about it. And she realizes, oh, there's more to this story than the folks at First Methodist in Evanston know. Because we're kind of sealed off, actually, as it turns out, from the lives of poor people. And so, as it turned out, the strike ends. Amazing photographs of Grant Park in Chicago, full of military encampment. There's a huge clashes, violent clashes in the streets of Chicago. Back of the yards, the stockyards district, where a lot of rail cars were stored, goes up in flames. Riots, federal troops come in to kind of quell the riots. As that's all kind of the dust hasn't even settled on all of that. And the University of Chicago comes along and says, hey, we want to found a settlement house in the back of the yards. And it goes to Jane Addams and it says, who do you think should be in charge of this thing? And Jane Addams says, oh, you have to talk to Mary McDowell because she has an enthusiasm for righteousness. And sure enough, the University of Chicago gets in touch with Mary McDowell, says, would you be willing to move to back of the yards? Now, remember, McDowell's up in Evanston. She's lived most of her life in this very comfortable, gorgeous suburb right on the shores of Lake Michigan. She's being asked to move to one of the worst neighborhoods in America. I mean, this was the kind of place, it was stinky. It was the place for the stockyards where all the animals were slaughtered for the nation, where the stockyards bosses would lay out pig carcasses and let them dry in the sun. So the stench, the smell, the pollution, plus in the view of many of the folks in Evanston, it was the people, right? These are poor immigrants who don't speak English. They are a threat to democracy. That was the word in Protestant churches across the country. These are the folks who are going to take America down. They don't understand America. They don't understand Christianity. They go to the saloon. We don't know what they do in the saloon, but we don't think it's good. Most people wouldn't want to even set foot in this kind of neighborhood, right? And so McDowell's being asked to move there, and she does. She spent the rest of her life there. She spent the second half of her life in back of the yards. And over the course of her time there, she got involved in everything. She got involved in sanitation campaigns. She got involved in campaigns for, against the Democratic machine in Chicago. She got involved with campaigns for racial justice. She got involved with campaigns for labor rights. She was just on the ground. She gets involved with the founding of the NAACP, with the founding of the Women's Trade Union League, all sorts of social movements. And she's also involved with the founding of the social work profession. McDowell was someone who was a devout Christian, but who believed that the churches had gone astray, that the churches had lost their way. And actually, she gets called on the carpet by a kind of purportedly social gospel guy, publishes this article in his journal that's sort of very critical of the settlement houses and says, you know, these settlement house people, they're doing things outside of the church. They're not leading with evangelism. They're not leading with kind of traditional Christian doctrine. They're leading with this social justice stuff. And McDowell reads this article in the journal, and she says, you know, she writes Shaler Matthews, this professor at the University of Chicago Divinity School, a letter, and she says, I really didn't like this piece. And I didn't like it because for me, I do all of this because of my faith. She says, must we not see Christ back of the yards? Because I found him there among these people that you won't come near. So I think about people like Mary McDowell when I think about this tradition too, right? Rauschenbusch is in a fancy seminary. McDowell's back of the yards, and she really came to believe that for Christians, part of what it meant to be faithful was to find ways to connect in a serious way with the poor, and not just to connect with them in a sense of a helping way, but to connect with them in a sense of taking on their burdens in some sense as her own. That's how she kind of came to see it. And for her, that was the way to kind of both be faithful as a Christian, but also it was the way to really restore American democracy, which seemed at that moment to be under deep threat. So,
Heath, that's a perfect segue in connection to a question we've already gotten in our chat box, that rather than wait, I want to go right to the question because it's so relevant to what you're talking about.
Yeah.
And this is from a question to everybody from Gary Davis. Didn't Rauschenbusch want to make Protestantism into a social project by taking it out of the churches? This is the process that we call secularization, even though it's actually religious.
Yeah. I love this letter exchange. So, I mean, I love archival work. This is, you kind of have to if you're a historian, right? Because you spend a lot of time in archives, and I love the detective work part of this. So I was in Rauschenbusch's papers, which are down in Atlanta, and just kind of going through all these correspondence, and I run across this letter that he got, that he sent, to William Bell Riley. William Bell Riley was one of the kind of leading conservative ministers of the early 20th century up in Minnesota. Rauschenbusch wrote him a letter because he learned that Riley at one of his revivals had been saying this sort of thing, that, Rauschenbusch isn't really a Christian. He's not really interested in what we think of as Christianity. He's interested in some other thing. It's another different kind of project. And Rauschenbusch got wind because a student of his had actually been at the revival meeting. You gotta be careful about what you say about people in public, I guess. So he gets wind of this, and he writes Riley a long letter. And the whole point of the letter is, I am a deeply devout Christian. I believe in Jesus Christ. I come at these questions and I see that, and what he would argue in the letter, and went on to argue in the letter, is not that in seeking to kind of get the church engaged in the social world, he didn't see that as a secularizing move. He saw that as a re-sacralizing move. That in some sense, when the church decided at some point along the way, or at least when institutional kind of leaders of the churches decided that, the church isn't going to say anything about this issue, the church isn't going to say anything about that issue. These are separate from religious concerns. They're public matters, and religion's a private matter. That in some sense, what they were doing was ceding vast swaths of human life to secularity as such. That term's complicated in my field, but for the purposes of the conversation, that in some sense, what Rauschenbusch saw himself as doing is elevating the gospel, to say the gospel is actually about all of life, not just about your personal spiritual life, but it's about everything. How you spend your money, where you live, how you vote, all of these things are under, the rubric of the gospel. So I think that's what, and I think there's something to that idea. We could talk about kind of what some of the unintended consequences of these sorts of things might be, but certainly he didn't see it in any way as a kind of move away from Christianity. If you can't read Rauschenbusch, he wrote this beautiful book of prayers. And one of the things, if you start to get to know him in the ways that you can get to know someone who's passed away, is he had a deep personal piety. He loved Jesus. You just read his letters, you read his stuff, and he was alive in Christ, the way the pietists would say. He really deeply believed. So, yeah, as I said, lots to say about unintended consequences, but certainly that was how they saw it.
You just begged the next question in some ways, in terms of unintended consequences.
Yeah.
And what happened to this movement?
Yeah.
As the 20th century moved on and even into the 21st.
Well, so I think here's a couple of things, right? So the way I think about this, in my field, the social gospel is one of the oldest kind of topics you could write about. And it was really first written about while it was still in its sort of heyday. And the way that people thought about it was as a theological movement. It was a movement of pastors and seminary professors who had discovered in the early 20th century that the gospel had social meaning. The way I think about it, and the way I'm writing about it in this book, is this is a movement that really comes out of the experiences of poor people. It comes out of the experiences of people on the margins who didn't write systematic theologies, but they had profoundly theological intuitions, and they really believed God was with them in their daily struggle. So part of the story that I want to tell is the story of how did that experience and those intuitions, which started among the people, how'd those get into the churches? And I think that starts to happen by the early 20th century for a variety of reasons. Now, what we also know is by the 1930s, let me back up. In the first decade of the 20th century, you get the social creed and these kind of social teachings. Earlier in the Catholic Church, Rerum Novarum in 1891, a kind of body of social teaching emerges out of the institutional church starting in the early 20th century. Alongside that, in really rapid succession, you get the emergence of all of these new kinds of institutions, committees, everything from like big interdenominational things like the Federal Council of Churches and the National Catholic Welfare Conference, and to some extent the NAACP. But you also get every denomination has a committee on social action, a committee on social justice, et cetera, or committees on race, committees on labor, and eventually lots of those start to work together. So when the New Deal comes around, and I think this is very interesting, and you know, the New Deal, many of the folks who were involved in kind of the emergence of the New Deal program, they see it, again, we could talk about unintended consequences, we can talk about different views on it. They see it and they're advertising it as, this is the Sermon on the Mount come to life in our midst. That's what Harold Ickes says when he goes to talk to the Presbyterians in their General Assembly meeting in the early 1930s. He says, this is what Christ was calling, this is what he was talking about. Loving your neighbor, looking out for the poor, looking out, you know, being your brother or your sister's keeper. This is the thing. Now, what we know, and this guy starts to get to, you know, what happened, right? Many things happen, two big ones. One would be, there are folks who are never on board with that view, right? And we know that already in the 1930s, you start to have kind of partnerships between in the business world and different church worlds of folks who are organizing against this sort of organization. So they're organizing against the different social action bodies within the denominations. They're organizing against the Federal Council of Churches, entire denominations. The Southern Presbyterians pull out of the Federal Council of Churches like every other week. They're out and in and out and in and threatening to be out and threatening to be in, partly because they think that the Federal Council of Churches might be endorsing social equality. Federal Council of Churches actually isn't super progressive on racial equality in the first half of the 20th century. So their general secretary is writing letters back and saying, no, you don't, you know, we believe that our Black brothers and sisters are brothers and sisters in Christ, but we're not endorsing social equality, right? So there's this kind of political fight that starts to erupt in and around these institutions. And very quickly, they get gummed up. So these denominational bodies, the Federal Council, are just overwhelmed, hundreds and thousands of letters coming in, accusing them of leaving true Christianity behind. At the same time, the New Deal itself was upsetting the apple cart of Jim Crow in the South and around the country. And folks who had been really excited about New Deal programs in the early 1930s, and this is a great book, No Depression in Heaven, which looks at the kind of story of the New Deal in churches around the Mississippi Delta region, this deeply poor region in the 1930s, where initially churches were saying, hey, we got this. We don't need any federal help. We don't need, during the Great Depression. Eventually, they didn't have it. And there was just mass destitution across the Mississippi Delta region. And they reach out to FDR, and they welcome these New Deal programs. Back in 1935, FDR sends out a letter to every pastor in America and asks what their opinion is about the Social Security Act and other pieces of major New Deal legislation. And people love it. Pastors love it. And so my friend Allison Green wrote this book, No Depression in Heaven, and she starts the book by saying, we have this memory of the Great Depression, the greatest generation, as this generation that didn't need any help. But the reality is that these churches in one of the poorest regions of the country, in this moment of great need, needed help. But what we know is that, that memory, which, then this is getting into complicated material, and we can sort of get into some of this, and I'm happy to take pushback and talk more about it. Part of what happens is by the late 1940s, it was very clear to folks around the country that the New Deal had empowered organized labor. Organized labor was interracial in a way that it hadn't been since the 1880s, when the Knights of Labor were organizing Black and white workers. The CIO had come on the scene in 1935 and was organizing Black and white workers. And as the CIO, in the wake of World War II, starts to try to organize in the South, launches this huge Operation Dixie to organize workers across the South, people quickly realize, oh, labor has a lot of power, and labor is interracial, and Jim Crow is going to come crumbling down. And so you start to have, by the mid 20th century, major misgivings emerging about any kind of federal program that would either intentionally or unintentionally destabilize the country's racial regime. And that's so those two things, I would say. One, a kind of partnerships emerging between business and churches around kind of trying to very intentionally promote what historians call a gospel of free enterprise, a kind of alternative to the social Christianity that I've been talking about. You get the emergence of this kind of vision of a gospel of free enterprise. That's part one. But part two is a lot about the mid 20th century as the point when campaigns for equality start to also be about racial equality in a very serious way, a way that really threatens the racial order. And a lot of white Christians weren't here for that. And they back off very quickly. And again, we can talk more about why that is and whatnot. One of my colleagues wrote a book called Stone of Hope, where he argues that the reason the civil rights movement succeeded was because of its prophetic engagement with this kind of prophetic tradition in the Hebrew Bible, King's ability to draw on a very serious strain of Christian faith. I think he's right about that in part. But one of the other arguments in the book is that segregationism failed because it didn't have a kind of strong basis or strong root in Christianity in the same way. And I think my colleagues, since that book came out, have really resoundingly disproved that part of David Chappelle's book, and shown a great book, Mississippi Praying, shows how deeply segregationists believed that God had ordained segregation, and God was entirely arrayed against integration, civil rights, etc. And the reality that we know, and again, happy to talk more about this, is that white people did not, on the whole, participate in the civil rights movement, with some exceptions. But that's the big story. And then there are some exceptions to that big story. So when we think about equality, where did a tradition that was centered on this virtue of equality, saw Christianity as kind of a force for equality in society, where did it go? Partly it fell kind of asunder on the rocks of racism in the mid 20th century. And that's one of the hard truths that I think, for a white Christian like myself, it's important to grapple with. It's a serious issue. And it reflects back on these social gospelers too, many of whom, like Rauschenbusch had said, didn't build movements that were interracial.
So how was it then that, was there, I want to presume, was there a transformation in the 70s and into the 80s when some of the rhetoric or language of the social gospel, not the policies, but the language and piety of it, was actually taken up into a whole different set of churches, a different set of politics around abortion and free enterprise and certain issues about foreign policy and the like. And suddenly you have the moral majority and other groups who seem to take up this mantle for very different causes.
Yeah. I think the emergence of that tradition, which was profoundly influential in the last since the 1960s, right? And that's why when we started this conversation, I said, this is a tradition. It's easy to forget about social Christianity. It's easy to forget about social gospels and the ways that they deeply shape the country. It's because this other tradition emerges that in some ways has a similar vision. I don't think at this point that they were talking necessarily about Christianizing the social order, but they do have a similar kind of vision of bringing the country back to God, making America Christian again in a serious way. And part of what my colleagues have done a beautiful job of in the last 20 years is really trying to get at where did that come from? And it turns out it came from just like the social Christian tradition that I'm writing about came out of a generation of organizing, and then you get kind of results in the early 20th century. You have a tradition of organizing in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s that sort of starts in response to a variety of different phenomenon. Everything from New Deal programs and backlash against them to, historians talk about the 1950s and 1960s as an age of urban guerrilla warfare, as urban neighborhoods are becoming integrated. And frankly, there was just unending battles over turf in these neighborhoods because white Christians could not imagine Black people as their neighbors. And so those movements, and if you ever watched the Eyes on the Prize documentary, if you haven't seen it, you got to watch it. It's phenomenal. I still think it's the best documentary about the civil rights movement. It's so phenomenal because it has so much original footage, and then it has all these interviews with activists from the time. And so sometimes we think about the civil rights movement as something that happened in Alabama and Georgia and whatnot. Watch the episodes in Eyes on the Prize that are on Chicago and on Boston, where you had violent anti-Black riots when people talked about school busing, when people talked about integration of neighborhoods. So if you've got a kind of opposition to New Deal programs, you've got people organizing around neighborhoods, neighborhood associations start to bubble up all over the country as ways of defending neighborhoods against Black residential mobility, essentially. Later, in the 70s, you start to get a lot of interest in the issue of abortion, which was not an issue that evangelical Christians had really been super activated around before that. Catholics had been. And to some extent, some kind of social gospel folks have been actually pretty worried about abortion in the mid 20th century. But you have kind of a sort of surge in interest in abortion. Also ongoing kind of issues, right? I mean, we know that questions around school busing and whatnot were well into the 70s and the 80s. So all of these things are coming together. So I think part of what when we think about kind of this gospel free enterprise or this tradition that emerges in the latter half of the 20th century, it has, you can think about it as sort of different streams that come together. One of the most important streams actually was neither folks who were thinking especially seriously about New Deal programs, nor were they thinking about segregation. It was folks who had maybe were the children or the grandchildren of immigrants who kind of come of age in the cities. These folks had grown up in the suburbs, so they didn't have any experiences in this urban guerrilla warfare stuff. They grew up in the suburbs, and for a lot of these folks, they thought of themselves, and kind of one of the better books about them is called The Silent Majority, after what Richard Nixon talked about in the late 1960s. The silent majority thought of itself as, I'm not going to march for civil rights, but I'm not going to march against civil rights. I'm kind of in between. I'm kind of like happy about, I think we're making some progress. I think that's where we're going. I certainly don't think, and this is one of the keys for this kind of big demographic that emerges in kind of a suburbanizing United States in this period, and one of the big well springs of this latter tradition. They come from the suburbs. Many of their parents had really benefited from the GI Bill. Many of them have benefited from New Deal programs. There's not a great memory of that. So the memory is my family worked hard to get where we are. What we know, right? Historians would say there is no greater engine of the middle class, the post-war middle class, than the GI Bill. It sent a whole generation of vets to college. It sent helped a whole generation of vets to buy homes kind of on a federally subsidized mortgage. We also know that the GI Bill was a huge engine of racial inequality because Black people couldn't take advantage of either of those provisions. You couldn't get into a white college if you were Black in 1950. And because of redlining, which is a thing that we could get into if people want to know more about it, you couldn't buy a house in most parts of the country. So the silent majority, not remembering necessarily all this stuff, has this narrative that we worked hard, we got there. Now the federal government wants to come around and give people handouts, and I don't believe in that. And so there's this kind of huge surge in that kind of world, and that becomes one of the big engines. So those are not folks who are like George Wallace, segregation today, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever, nor are they super involved in the organizing against New Deal programs, but they're just folks who have a certain set of intuitions, which are so different, interestingly, than the intuitions of these social Christian folks that I'm talking about. Though everybody has the intuition that in some sense we need the country to be more Christian. It just looks very different.
I'm going to open up the screen, and we've got an intimate enough group tonight that I think we can have an open conversation. I could keep asking all kinds of questions, but I'm going to let others. I see John. I see that hand, John. That's my best Billy Graham invitation. I see that.
Feel free to push back and ask toughies. I like that. So
John Chapman, you're going to have to unmute yourself.
There I am. Okay. Hi. Excellent. I love what you're talking about, and just a little bit, parenthetically, in 2008, the Fran Park Center Theological Advisory Group presented a 6-lecture series on, I think it was called the Social Creed of 2008, and we dealt with these issues in details, right? But in fact, Wes came, I think, just before we began that series. This is going to be a question.
Good.
But it seems to me that in the 1890s, as you have this development of social gospel, it's also a period when you have the growth of what different people call different things, but pretty much modernism in terms of theology and Bible studies coming out of Germany and this type of thing. And it seemed to me there was quite a reaction against the social gospel movement, even in the early 20th or early 20th century. And it seems to me that divide tended to be similar to the divide between what you call the modernists and maybe the traditionalists. And it seems to me that one of the things coming up to that period of the 60s is that the generation that were adults in the 50s had a big belief in American ideals and Christian ideals and so on. But what happened with the advent of television and the beginning of these protest movements, a lot of their children could see their gap between the ideals of their parents and the reality of what was on the ground. And the television had an important movement in that. But it seems to me also interpretations of theology during that time, Robert McAfee Brown and so on, led to things like the Confession of 1967, really, which is profoundly different than previous confessions in the fact that he addressed some of these issues. And my question is, it seems to me today that we're still seeing a little bit of that gap between what I would call the modernists tend to be more receptive to the ideas of the current social issues, and it's the I'll say traditionalists, because it's not a pejorative word, tend to be more interpreting Christianity still in an old approach, a more traditional approach. Is that a reasonable assumption?
Yeah, thank you so much, John. I appreciate that. I think there's a lot to what you're saying. I'll say just a couple things. One is, and I was telling them before everyone else signed on, that right now I'm finishing a chapter on a guy, some of you may have heard of him, William Jennings Bryan, who is a well-known figure in the late 19th, early 20th century. He's best known, I think, for the Scopes trial. He's a main character with Clarence Darrow in Inherit the Wind, where he kind of comes off, he wins the trial, but kind of comes off as this sort of doddering, foolish country bumpkin. Bryan is an incredibly compelling figure in a lot of ways. And long before Scopes, he ran for president 3 times as a Democrat, and he was called the Great Commoner. He was basically a fundamentalist most of his life, very conservative. You use the word traditionalist, but he paired he took everything in the Bible seriously, including these passages where Jesus talks about the poor and the wealthy. And so he came out of a kind of conservative theological point of view to what you might call a kind of a progressive politics, right? So I think that there's certainly, and I guess the other thing I would say is one of the most famous, earlier, I was telling the folks before everyone else signed on about this too, that one of the earliest kind of Presbyterian modernists was a guy named David Swing in Chicago, who was brought up on heresy charges in the 1870s in the Presbyterian church. He gets off, but he leaves the church because he's sort of burned by it. He was a incredibly kind of politically conservative fellow. And his instincts were very much anti-labor and anti kind of poor people's movements. So it's complicated. One of the other sort of suggestions I would say in terms of like the complicatedness, right, is that what do we count as kind of conservative or traditional? What do we count as modernist or liberal, right? My friend Tim Glegg wrote this book called Guaranteed Pure, which is all about Moody Bible Institute in the early 20th century. You couldn't think of a kind of more conservative or traditional institution in some ways. The thing that Tim points out is that the movement that emerges around Moody, the kind of fundamentalist movement, and it's different what happens here at Princeton Seminary, where I teach now. It's a slightly different kind of moment with what goes on here. But the mainstream of kind of fundamentalism around places like Moody Bible Institute is a tradition that in some ways is more modern than anything you could ever imagine, in that it totally rejects churchly authority. Mm-hmm. It rejects the authority of the church. It rejects the authority of denominations. And so the movement that grows out of it, and that is huge today, right? The non-denominational movement, the movement of kind of parachurch and non-denominational churches, in some sense, oftentimes these churches, so the way Tim talks about it, is they have a brand of a kind of a conservative brand, but in some sense, what they're doing, the kind of project that they're about, is in whatever ways it's conservative, it's also sort of path-breakingly innovative, adaptive, new and modern, totally open to sort of market impulses, and so I mean, it's fascinating, right? If you go to a kind of conservative church today, oftentimes they've got all the bells and whistles in terms of the lights and the kind of sound and all this kind of stuff. And you go into a liberal church and it might in many ways appear very traditional. That's sort of the kind of thing that he wants to capture. But I think it also has implications in terms of the kind of political questions too. So you are right in that I think today oftentimes we think, oh, if you're progressive politically, you're progressive theologically, and vice versa, right? Conservative theology, conservative politics, these kind of seem like natural pairs. But I would say both today and in the past, there's lots of other configurations actually. And whether you find that sort of encouraging or discouraging, I think it's encouraging potentially, because part of what it can mean, we live in this incredibly polarized moment, obviously in American life right now. Part of what I think, and part of why I love history, is you go into the past and you can kind of, I think, go underneath some of the kind of ideological polarization. It's so hard, right? I mean, when I go back and I read these documents from the late 19th century, and I'm reading about Christians talking about inequality and labor conflict and all these sorts of things, it's not in the context of contemporary politics. It's just, I can learn so much. It's this great cloud of witnesses that's gone before us that helps us to really, I think, hopefully in our best, kind of break out of the kind of polarization that is so confounding for us today. So that's what I would say, is that there's certainly a lot of what you're talking about is true, but it doesn't have to be that way.
Let me ask in light of that about John Wesley.
Yeah.
Or F.D. Morris and Christian, mid 19th century Christian socialism.
Yeah.
As hyper pious, conservative theologically, and what we would consider socially progressive, at least for their time.
Totally.
Politically.
And this is very common at the grassroots. I mean, I think I mentioned Ida B. Wells earlier in the conversation, and she's someone who, she's a deeply devout Christian, and it's because she's a Christian that she is intent on convincing white people to care about lynching. And she sees this as just this incredible lack of faithfulness that, here in our own land, which she explicitly talks about it, Christian America, this is a scandal for Christian America that people are being murdered and tortured in these ways. And she goes around and tries to convince everybody of it. And she's coming at it out of her faith, right? Not as a sort of a political project, but she actually has her own vision of Christian America, and she doesn't think America is living up to it. So lots of examples of this kind of thing where people come to these social questions out of a deep faith.
Carolyn.
Thank you for all that you're sharing. I guess this question is twofold. One, does cultural amnesia and systemic racism work together to kind of create a contradictory understanding of the Bible's message on social justice?
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah.
And to what extent? Because as you're talking, I hear two churches.
Yeah.
Being African-American, there's always been my understanding of the Bible, right? Really much parallel to, I guess, liberation theology, what comes out of the Latin American theology. But then there seems like the white church, when people say church, they very much have to give it an identifier. It's like the Black church or the Latin church, but when they say church, they really mean the white church, right? And so I guess to what extent then are we having all this because we forget?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Some of it, I guess, could be intentional, but just the whole amnesia.
Yeah. Well, I think, one of the things I also believe, so I was saying a moment ago that history can be a way around or through ideological polarization. It's also, I think, an essential starting place for reflection about these questions of kind of where do we go from here? Can we share the future, right? Well, what happened? How did we get here? And the reality is, and I spent 7 years teaching in the Midwest before I came to Princeton Seminary, teaching undergraduates, many of whom were coming from kind of conservative, Midwestern, white church backgrounds and whatnot. And part of what I was doing there was helping folks to kind of have a kind of encounter with the reality of how we got here and where does racial inequality come from, for example. There's a kind of debate in our society about the origins of racial inequality, but in my field, there's no debate. We know actually why there is a massive wealth and income gap down racial lines. And it's not actually, in my view, it's not hard to understand this when you really read up on history and you recognize that into my parents' lifetime, there were massive systems and structures that were legal and clearly made it impossible for Black people to accrue wealth, for example. Into this very moment, right? There, we could talk about, I have a friend who just published a book on mass incarceration and thinking about that as an ongoing kind of, right when the kind of walls of Jim Crow come crumbling down, supposedly in the 1960s, you have a carceral state built that we know imprisons Black and brown people at disproportionate rates, despite the fact that white people use and sell drugs, for example, at equivalent rates. So, when you get at, if we want to move forward on these questions, what should the church have to say about race? What should the church have to say about inequality today? I think it's essential for us to know our history. And I think, I'll just speak for my own experience, right? As a white person who grew up in Christian churches all my life, who went to an elite college and went on to get my PhD. It wasn't really until graduate school that I myself really came to understand this question of how we got here. Where does racial inequality come from? It was when I read Thomas Agrew's The Origins of the Urban Crisis. It was when I read Edmund Morgan's American Slavery, American Freedom, and realized that this story goes all the way back, way before the founding of the nation. And as a white person who grew up in kind of a son of the silent majority, right? For me, I never had to know that stuff, and it never touched me. And I never was, like Mary McDowell for the first half of her life, I was living in communities where I never heard any other side, at least in a way that I would take seriously, right? So it was in college and then graduate school. And when I think about that, and so now I do this work, right? I teach these classes on Black history. I teach classes on social gospels and whatnot. And I taught a class last year. Katie Rosenson was in that class, I believe, on the social Christian tradition in American life. And I said at one point in the class, which is true, that for many white Christians in the late 19th century, it wasn't just that they didn't care about lynching, but in many cases, white Christians saw lynching as something that good Christian people participated in. That's the depth of the sin and depravity that we have to grapple with. And I think we haven't grappled with it. And when we forget about it, right, I think here's the thing, right? So it's important just to know for our own purposes, how'd we get here? But I think it's also important to know because it gives us the right posture to that next question of where do we go from here? I think as a person who now knows this history, I need to come at that next question with a lot of humility and a quickness to listen and a slowness to speak, to be honest, a lot of times in these conversations. And that's not where we're at as a society and as a church. And I think a lot of it does have to do with, and this is the last thing I'll say about this. History is contested ground in these kinds of social cultural debates, right? Wonderful article on the long civil rights movement and the purposes of the past by Jacqueline Dowd Hall. And she talks about how in the generation after Martin Luther King was assassinated, King was remade in American mythology as someone who, King himself at various points made very clear, he was basically a democratic socialist. And in fact, he was being tracked throughout his life as a communist by the FBI. He was widely reviled in white Christian communities up until the point of his death. He's been remade as this kind of American hero, American sort of teddy bear figure. And one line from his I Have a Dream speech in 1963 has come to stand in for all of King's thought. It's this line that he says, I have a dream that one day my children will be, let's see, not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. And this line has been taken and become the basis for a kind of reimagining of King as a kind of champion of colorblind America. And nothing could be further from the truth, but there's a lot of power in that story because that story does work. So I see this for Christians who want to be faithful. And part of what we have to do is to know our history. We don't all have to study and become history majors and all that kind of stuff, but church history matters and it's relevant to our lives today because it becomes a basis for really good, faithful conversations like the ones y'all are hosting here about where do we go? And if we don't know how we got here, we're going to be real confused when it comes to that question of where do we go from here. So.
Hey, Dr. Carter, I have a question.
Yeah.
So part of this comes out of our class from last semester, but we talked a lot about, I feel like our class specifically, there were a lot of large discussions of folks like social Christians who were on the side of working with individual people and the changing hearts thing versus the working on systemic change thing. And so I've still been thinking about that a lot since that class. And I thought about it a lot when Fran Park Center did the 21-day challenge and those discussions. So thinking about the common good, this is on the common, do you think that both, and you can do it in context of like then and now, do you think that the social Christians who were concerned with changing hearts equally address the common good as those who are focused on systemic structures.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, here's what I would say. The folks that I write about and I myself, I think that we do need to engage systems and structures. And you know, this is a big debate in the history of American Christianity, right? It goes all the way back, I mean, way back. You can think about it, the abolition movement, right? Abolitionists said, we've got to tackle a structure. And there were folks who said, we got to make slavery more Christian. That was a very important point of view. Other people said, well, slavery's wrong, we need to get rid of it, but not right away. And abolitionists said, you know, we got to tackle, this is a systemic evil. One of the alums of Princeton Seminary famously assassinated, he was an abolitionist editor. And he said, this is a sinful system that needs to be tackled. And I think, you know, when we listen, if I listen to the voices of faithful believers today who are talking about things like mass incarceration, which is something, you know, I had a colleague who was talking about, you know, in some sense, we talk about, there's been a lot of talk in the last 50 years about Black families, right? And people sometimes think about Black families and they talk about Black families in the context of moral failings, but one of my colleagues talks about the greatest threat to the Black family is the carceral state, which over the last generation has disproportionately imprisoned Black men at rates that are virtually without parallel in the world. And so, you know, how do we talk about loving our neighbors without engaging kind of these big forces in our national life and our community life? Now, here's one thing I'll add, right? All of us are finite humans. We all have limits. We all live in particular places. And I think a lot of times, one of the ways that you can kind of get involved with these questions is very locally. Go to a public meeting, go to a school board meeting, go to I lived in Valparaiso, Indiana for 7 years and got pretty involved in the community there. And part of what you realize is like, wow, public meetings, even in a small town like Valpo, they're wild and not very many people go to them. What I found in my community was if I went as a, you know, relatively young guy and you know, raising boys in this town, people were A, shocked that I was there. What are you doing here? But B, I love to say, you know, because of my faith and because I'm a parent and because, you know, whatever, I'm really concerned about this thing that's going on in our schools. That's, in my view, you know, school systems are systems, actually. And so that's a way to, you know, so it doesn't all have to be, we're not gonna, as individuals, I don't think, be able to like, you know, somehow change everything in the world. But if more Christians started going to public meetings and listening and getting engaged in their community, and I think especially important for me, I find it's really important for me to listen to Black and brown Christians and what they're concerned about in my community and what they're saying. I think that's important. And I learn a lot, and it helps me to know where to get involved. A lot of times, you know, I think as I've given talks around the country and whatnot, people say, well, what can I do? Lots of people are already doing a lot of things. And so one thing that sometimes the best thing to do is to figure out what's already going on in your community and how can you support those things that are going on. And I guess the last thing I would say is I don't see kind of individual and structural action as, those don't have to, it's not an either or, right? We're all involved in relationships. We can do the right thing in those relationships, but we can also do the right thing in the various kind of layers of community that we're all involved in, all the way up to voting and government and all that kind of stuff. But it, you know, it starts way lower down, the PTA.
I'm sorry, who else is, I was muted. Who else has a question? I think I saw John put a hand up. Anybody else? Yeah, John. If you're blacked out and if you don't have a picture on the screen, you can just type in the chat box if you like, or let us know you want
Okay,
to.
no,
Go ahead.
I don't mean to monopolize or dominate, but I found something very instructive and helpful
Hmm.
in the last year in college athletics, particularly in football.
Mhm.
And I follow a particular football team very closely,
Hmm.
and college. And this team decided to deal with the issue of racism.
Hmm.
And the coach is a black coach, one of the few black coaches.
Yeah.
The athletic director is black, one of the few black director of athletics. And they promoted many small discussions among players, larger discussions among the team, and in many of the white athletes, football players, said, I never understood that. I never understood what happened to you. I didn't understand your life. And we recruit on a national basis, and we had a sampling of the country as a whole, from young men in black, white, all kinds, from all kinds of class standings and levels and so on. And it was a matter of that open discussion. And when the white ball players began to understand the lives of the black ball players, it unified the team very much to deal with the issues of racism, because there was an honest acquaintance and knowledge and respect, which led to action. So it was kind of that the idea of the individual was changed, which is leading now to systemic change.
Yeah. And I think, I mean, to me, in many ways, I think that's how a lot of this stuff happens. And if you look at someone like Mary McDowell and the things that she was just an individual who got involved with a community, and it took her in all sorts of crazy directions. And I think that's often, if you read church history, you find so often that's the case, right? That you get involved in this one little thing, and God gets involved there with you, and you end up in places you never thought you would go. And Dorothy Day, who was a kind of Christian activist and really pretty profound thinker, but also doer, and she at one point she ran up, as she was aging, she ran up against a lot of young people who said, what can one person do anyway? And Day has this great line in one of her books where she says, I really believe that the problem with young people these days is they don't understand what God can do with a little effort. He said, we lay one brick at a time, we take one step at a time, and we pray that God will multiply the fruits of our labors like Jesus multiplied the loaves and the fishes. And I think that's true. I don't know what y'all think about this, and if this is too much to talk about, we're running out of time, it's fine. But last year, right before the pandemic, I actually was in Arizona. I went to Tucson, and I met up with folks who were involved around a Presbyterian church, Southside Presbyterian Church in Tucson, in the sanctuary movement. And I don't know how much you know about the sanctuary movement of the early 1980s and whatnot, but it became this international movement. It started at Southside Presbyterian Church in Tucson, Arizona, and it started because some women who were friends with the young pastor of that church worked for a neighborhood organization that was trying to help out immigrant workers. And through those women and their connections, that church got involved in ministry at a detention center. And as it turned out, through those same women, terrible tragedy in the early 1980s, was a huge refugee crisis in Central America. People were being slaughtered in a number of Central American countries, and people were fleeing north. And one of the things that happened, people came across the desert, and it was a terribly hot season, and people died in the desert. A number of people survived, but a number of people died. Some of the survivors found their way to Southside Presbyterian Church, And basically through these individual relationships, this church became a kind of international center of Christian witness in the public square around the plight of immigrants and refugees. And they still are today. And one of the things, I interviewed about 20 of these folks, and they're ordinary, regular old people. They had all sorts of different stories about how they got involved with the movement. It was all through friends. It was all through relationships. It was all through who they knew. And they were very intentional. And I think this is kind of one of the themes maybe of this, for me, of what kind of emerging in this conversation. Like Mary McDowell, right? They had put themselves in a position to where they couldn't ignore or forget the serious social issues that we as a nation were facing. And because they put themselves in that position, they found themselves confronted with little choices along the way, right? Am I going to do this? Am I going to do that? Well, if I do this, then I do that. Oh, he wants me to come with him to this thing. And there was this sense of some small effort that became something huge. Hundreds and hundreds of churches all around the country became involved in a sanctuary network out of this one little church in Tucson, Arizona. I find that kind of thing, whatever you think about the particulars of that example, that kind of thing, right, is one of the most inspiring, refreshing things you can find into all church history, right? That through the little things that we might do, the little one faithful decision you make one day, you never know what might come of it. And so make the, tomorrow's a new day, and it's a new opportunity to see what may come, what may God do.
So if in our last session, Heath, we our speaker Miroslav Volf, and you were present for that and heard that, sort of developed a metaphor for us to think about, and the common good and what we share together.
Yeah.
And explored that metaphor about home and homing in a time of homelessness or dehoming of the world. How do we rehome the world? In what you're describing here, and the passion you just described, and the movements you're tracing and thinking about, and the history you're attempting to understand in new ways, is there a metaphor that comes out of that we could begin to think about the very thing you're describing about, the next step and what that means? What kind of metaphor or image could guide us from what you're reading and discovering?
Yeah, that's a great question. I really enjoyed Miroslav's talk, and I thought a lot of what he was talking about in terms of an open home versus a fortress home, the boundaries of kind of privacy and our openness to community. He talked at one point about this idea of a New Jerusalem, right? Leaning into the direction of a New Jerusalem, even as we also are kind of stuck in the muck and the mire of this world. All of that resonated for me. I mean, a lot of the folks that I am writing about were interested in this biblical metaphor of kingdom, and God's kingdom, right? God's kingdom coming, and Jesus's talk about a kingdom coming. Some people then take up that metaphor and put a little twist on it. I mean, Martin Luther King obviously loved to talk about beloved community, and beloved community as something that's not easily bounded, something that's sort of mysterious in certain ways, and something that spills over the boundaries of institutions and churches and whatnot, but is also encompasses them. So I think those are the first two that come to mind for me in terms of thinking about this stuff. But I think, in some sense, I love the title of the series that y'all are doing, and I think a lot of the folks that I'm thinking about and writing about were really interested in this question of how do we, kind of as Miroslav said, how do we lean into the future that God has in mind? Even right now, even amidst all the brokenness and the sinfulness and the difficulty and the challenge and the imperfection, right? How do we lean into that future that God has in mind? And so they looked at the Bible. I mean, that's where I think, some of these social movements, right? They're deeply interested in what the Bible has to say about what's to come. Because in some sense, I think a lot of these folks believe we were called, even if they didn't think we could accomplish it. There's debates about that, right? But even if we couldn't accomplish it, we were called to kind of cooperate with the future that God has in mind. So.
We have Katie Rosenson to thank for suggesting you tonight. So Katie, thank you. When I said, who do we need to talk to at Princeton? She said Heath Carter.
Yeah.
I'm really grateful for your time tonight. I
Oh,
think I want to remind you all, I also want to thank Mike Hegeman, who is kind of coordinating us tonight, and Kelly McGinn's absent. So thank Kelly McGinn for kind of putting all these pieces together. And remember, our next session is with Taurian Webb from Evanston, Illinois, from Garrett Seminary. And then we have a final session more with our pastors and the rest of us here on the screen. We will have a podcast. There will be a podcast coming out, a kind of 20-minute version of a conversation with Heath about some of these themes. And any other last questions quick questions for him? I don't see any hands. We have some great, Mike, we have some great comments in the chat box. So I'll take a look at that. And Mike, go ahead.
Just here to remind everybody about that we have a Fran Park Center YouTube page, which is where we can find the full session of 2 weeks ago. And this conversation tonight was recorded, and that will go up over the weekend. So invite your friends to the Fran Park Center site on YouTube. You're going to find a lot of great things there. And I will send out links sometime early next week, again, to all of these, the things we're creating here, as well as our podcast. So thank you for.
Oh, I'm sorry, Mike.
No, go ahead.
Any last, remember tomorrow afternoon, I shouldn't say this because if somebody's watching it later on the recording, but tomorrow afternoon, which is Thursday, 3 o'clock, we post Park Center, half-hour television show starring Mike Hegeman called Tasting the Bible.
Indeed.
Dropped on YouTube at 3 o'clock every Thursday during Lent. Friends, thank you for joining us tonight. Heath, can you stay on for just a second before we close
absolutely.
out? Good night, everybody. God bless you.
Good night.